From Software has a pretty good case for being the single best game developer in the world right now. They're popping Game of the Years like they're Tic Tacs. Everything they produce has unmatched level design, bosses, combat, lore, and creativity, and they've been at the top of their game for over a decade. They've made some of my favorite games ever, and I love them. Look, I drew a little picture. Look how cute we are. But, like everything you love, it's always a good idea to describe in vivid detail the things you hate about them and wish they would change and make them less desirable overall, especially when it's a core fixture of their personality. Ever since the Souls genre took off, From Software games have had the unofficial title of tough but fair. That was how a lot of people lured others into this series. Yes, these games are tough, but they are fair, so you can beat them. But while I obviously agree with the last part of that statement, the more I thought about it, the more I wondered, wait, but like, are they? And in some ways, yeah, they are. The combat follows a rigid set of rules. You can react to most things on the fly as long as you have your wits about you, and if you do get caught off guard, you always have the chance to try again with more knowledge of what you're going up against. But in other ways, no, I don't think these games are always fair, and the more polished quality of life updates and modernization they receive, the more that lack of fairness, which once felt like more of a byproduct of the grungy, scruffy charm of the series, feels more like a problem than a feature. And I think that becomes really evident when you see how frantically From rescales weapons and nerfs bosses post-release, something that they've always kind of done to some capacity, but it seems especially haphazard now. And just to clarify for some people who might be new here and don't know my gamer credentials, I've played and beat all of these games and their DLC. I've platinumed these ones as well, and I would consider a good few of them to be some of my favorite games of all time. And in a weird way, I kind of like how unfair some of them can be. I sometimes self-inflict even more unfair rules on myself because I'm a legitimate psychopath. I like the late game Elden Ring bosses that everyone shat on for being poorly balanced, so before you call me a little beta boy who's complaining about the difficulty, 1, I still beat it, so cry about it, nerd, and 2, I'm not even complaining, okay? I'm analyzing. Which is the same thing, it's just more pretentious. In my opinion, From Software's fairest difficulty curves are in the games that came out kinda in the middle. Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro really hit the sweet spot. Even though Sekiro is hard as shit, there's nothing that stands out as uncharacteristically difficult out of nowhere. We're gonna talk a little bit about some of the ways they managed to do that and how the next games didn't in a sec, but first, let's quickly touch on the 3 Souls games that came out before them. Actually, you know what? Everyone already knows that Dark Souls 2 suffers from bad hitboxes and that weird iframe system, and Demon Souls was still clearly just ironing out some kinks, so let's focus on Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 1 is one of the most mechanically consistent in this family of games. It's very predictable once you have a knowledge of the systems, and as a counterweight to make it more difficult, it tries to limit that knowledge by introducing a steady stream of new ideas and sometimes obscuring old ones. This is a really good solution that's unfortunately incredibly easy to overstep with. For instance, mimics are an example of doing this well. If you know nothing about the game when you first start playing it, the first mimic will almost definitely trick you and kill you. But after that point, you know to be careful with chests. You learn at some point that you can hit any chest before you open it to test if it's a mimic, and you might even realize that the way that the chain is pointing, or even the fact that the chest is lightly breathing, are other ways to identify these little homages to British dentistry. The rules are now set, and they're unwaveringly followed. The same goes for any section where an enemy rolls a boulder down a staircase or sets a bridge on fire. You might not know immediately that that's gonna happen, but when you make your way back, you now know to hang back for a second before walking forwards. On the other hand, where the game goes overboard is by trying to throw you off from what you've already learned until this point with ham-fistedly implemented level design. And I know, even just saying that sentence has the potential to incur the wrath of 1,000 neckbeards or unleash an ancient curse that kills 3 random gamers from Des Moines. I get it, okay? This game is beloved in no small part because of its bold level design, and it's arguably the thing that the studio does best. But enough time has passed. Okay, we can be honest with each other here, right? We're at that point in our relationship, I feel like. Some of these levels and boss arenas worked really well, but some of them didn't. Realistically, is it fair that at one point you're tasked with fighting a boss on a staircase with 2 dogs attacking you in a confined space when the game has a feature where your swing can be interrupted by walls? Even if you know what you're in for with the boss eventually, this combat system and this attack interrupt mechanic were not designed to work effectively in an arena like this. This fight is in direct conflict with how the game should be designed, and not in a fun turn of phrase way, but in a way that momentarily strips away what makes the game work just so they could throw the player off balance. Is it fair that in a game that's built around giving you perfect information where you can see what's coming at you and react to it instead of playing a Battleship-esque guessing game, that there's a level where all the lights are off and you now have to shuffle around slowly trying not to fall off this huge elevated maze. It's either not fair or not fun or both. Is it fair that one of the bosses essentially uses bad hit registration and unwieldy terrain that the physics don't play nice with as its main source of difficulty? Is it fair that certain corners and blockades give the camera an aneurysm and the game does little to limit that problem? I would argue that for all of those cases, the answer is no. And in a way, that unfairness is part of the game's ethos, and people who are claiming that these old games were tough but fair either had lizard brains or wanted to trick people into suffering with them. Because no, Dark Souls 1 is not tough but fair for shit. But I don't think it's trying to be. Miyazaki has said that these games are about overcoming adversity, not necessarily impossible levels of difficulty, and what better way to overcome adversity than to not just fight the enemies in the game, but fight the game itself to a degree. It keeps putting you in situations that don't seem easily solvable with your set of tools, but you have to figure it out anyways. If you look at the evolution of the series though, it becomes clear that FromSoft's mentality going forward either shifted slightly or they learned how to execute their original vision better. You have to realize that Dark Souls, as influential as it was made at a time that From was still learning how to refine their style and gameplay loop, and you can see that in later iterations they decided to stray away from that sudden, disruptive, sometimes counterintuitive design and levels to challenge the player, and instead made everything more readable and sensible. That may not have been the direction that everyone thinks the series should have gone, which is why Dark Souls 1 is still some people's favorite, but it is what ended up happening. Now me personally, I like the direction they took. Instead of having a rigid set of rules crammed through jagged hallways they weren't built for, you had games made in service of them. Boss arenas became a lot wider overall to complement how important spacing is to this combat system. You weren't equally susceptible to losing souls because of a difficult enemy as you were to the camera getting caught awkwardly during a 5-minute run back, because now the camera was smoother and the runbacks were shorter. Dark areas didn't leave you completely blind, and janky platforming sections were limited, became gradually less difficult, and were made mainly optional. Of course, if these were the only kinds of changes being made, the games would get really easy really fast. Every single one of these decisions being retroactively applied to Dark Souls 1 would make it an absolute cakewalk, so something else needed to be targeted to maintain the overall goal of overcoming challenge. And what the studio seemed to land on was the heavy manipulation and sometimes over manipulation of enemy traits, which can lead to some inconsistent difficulty. Difficulty balancing is a delicate procedure. More than just more health or more damage, it's about the traits or advantages and disadvantages of you and what's trying to hurt you. A good example is poise, or the ability to not be staggered out of an action while being attacked. For any particular action game, you need to ask questions like, does the enemy have poise? Should the player character have it? Is there a limit or meter associated with it? And does it happen at all times or only with certain special moves? For example, if your game has powerful spells but wants to emphasize skill and timing with them, you should probably not give the player a ton of poise while they're cooking up those spells. Case in point, Lies of P lets you get knocked out of any of your special weapon arts during their animation, and if you get knocked out of it, you lose the ability until you can build it back up again. For a punishing game with low enemy counts during encounters and not a ton of hectic projectile-filled combat, this makes a lot of sense. In the Norse God of War saga though, you're playing as a powerful tank of a character, and a lot of emphasis has been put on your weapon abilities, which do most of your damage. You're also usually fighting large groups with a ton of range attacks coming your way at all times, so all of your powerful abilities come with a lot of poise. You're always able to pull off your big moves without getting interrupted, even when you take damage during them. If you just straight swap the poise systems in Lies of P and God of War, Lies of P would get significantly easier, God of War would get significantly harder, and both games would be worse off for it. The choice of how to implement poise is intrinsically linked to each respective game's combat tempo, cadence, goals, and challenge level. This is kind of the difference between what we call artificial difficulty, which just feels like a bunch of health and damage numbers being tweaked, and more organic difficulty. It's more granular and often requires a retooling of a lot of small elements to reach a satisfying equilibrium. It's also not uncommon for these traits to shift back and forth slightly within a single experience. I mean, at a basic level, especially in an action RPG, enemies will have more powerful attacks as the game goes on, but you'll probably have more abilities to counter that. And to me, difficulty spikes, particularly unfair difficulty spikes, can be defined as when the traits of the things that oppose you quickly and drastically increase, while yours receive minimal or no change. I know it kind of sounds like I found the world's longest way to say game hard when guy strong, and I kinda did. But the main thing I want to emphasize is that stronger doesn't necessarily mean does more damage or has more health. It's usually more subtle mechanics. Do they have additional enemies you need to deal with at the same time? Are they able to heal? Do they have significantly shorter openings? Do they limit your abilities somehow? Do they have status effects? Do their attacks command more space? Do they have tracking? Are they immune to certain damage types, etc.? Interestingly enough, Demon Souls did this a lot. It constantly changes the rules for both you and the bosses you're facing. The Storm King is fought at a distance with a special weapon, the old hero is blind, but he can hear you, so you have to be careful how much noise you're making, and the Adjudicator has a single weak point that you need to target, everywhere else does less damage. Dark Souls 1 opted for a much different approach. Like I said, it's got a more standardized set of rules that applies to nearly everything you fight, and is incredibly consistent mechanically. It's how it's packaged that causes you issues. But in the newer games, we see more of Demon Souls' identity seep into the boss design. Yorm is another attempt at the Storm King idea, Rykard sort of melds it with the normal combat system, Radahn gives you the option to fight with an army, Owl has a smoke bomb that takes away your ability to heal for a short period of time, Mog steals your health halfway through the fight, a few bosses and mini-bosses in Sekiro all but require you to use certain consumables to not die instantly or do anything more than chip damage. With every release, a higher percentage of these encounters are introducing new mechanics that might only apply to one boss fight. More than just a different moveset, they fundamentally change how the boss works. Now usually this creates something really special. A lot of the bosses that I just mentioned are some of my favorites that FromSoft has ever done, but sometimes there are changes that are made too drastically, too suddenly, without giving you, the player, any proper recourse. Armored Core 6 already has a notorious difficulty spike at the end of its first chapter with Balteus, who has a recharging pulse shield, homing missiles, attacks that suffocate the space around you, a giant flaming sword, and a lot more speed than anything you fought before. All of this stuff comes out of nowhere and you're asked to figure it all out at once. Not long after the game released, a few bosses were hit with nerfs because the community found them to be way too difficult for what was around them, with Balteus' tracking on his homing missiles taking a big hit and his health being lowered as well. But even though I agree that the difficulty was disproportionately high for this section of the game, I don't think it comes down to his damage output or his dead-eye tracking. I think it came more from the fact that the game didn't train you properly, and also the options that you have during this fight are very hard to access in the early game. Those are obviously things that can really be fixed with a patch, but they should have been fixed before the game was released in the first place, and it's a mistake that I feel the studio wasn't really making even just a few years ago. In fact, the exact quote-unquote FromSoft B team that worked on AC6 did this perfectly back in 2019 with Sekiro. Before one of the more difficult fights in the game, at least in your first playthrough, Genichiro, they placed a glass cannon mini-boss who conditions you to learn the game's parry mechanic well and see how it can be used to your advantage. This mini-boss is a pain in the ass if you fight him like a Souls boss, but if you can nail the parry timings like this game wants you to, you can drain his health in less than 20 seconds. And now that that idea has been instilled in you, when you see Genichiro's flurry attack right after, which before this fight might have seemed like something you'd be better off running away from, you can actually see it as an opportunity to do significant posture damage. Now you could argue that Sekiro is a lot easier to balance because it's just got one weapon and one build, fair enough, but something like this where you're just training the player to use the mechanics properly is something that you could apply to any game. In Armored Core, you don't have iframes like the Souls games, dodging does not make you briefly invincible, and if you try to dash through bullets, you will 100% take damage. And one of the things I learned eventually in this game was that because of this, taking advantage of your spacing and airtime was actually way more beneficial than dodging. Dodging could help with last-minute maneuvering, but you were able to avoid a lot of these situations to begin with if you were just constantly moving around, beside, and especially over enemies. And while that seems obvious to me now, at first my conditioning had me staying somewhat low despite having a lightweight build and trying to rely on avoiding damage at the last minute by dodging. That's how I tried to fight Balteus, and that's why it took me over 3 hours to finally beat him by the skin of my teeth. Once I had my eureka moment though, just by playing around with the first couple of missions after the fight and realizing how to make effective use of the movement, I went back and absolutely smoked the dude without breaking a sweat. It was like I was playing an entirely different game even though it had only been like 30 minutes. Given this game has roughly 687 mini-bosses, I wish that one of them had a moveset that involved a big, low, sweeping attack like a huge melee swing or a giant wall of rockets shooting forward, and another one maybe featured a simple pulse shield just so you could come across it at least once. If those hypothetical enemies were placed anywhere before Balteus, you could keep him just as difficult in theory, but in practice he becomes way more manageable. Of course, the other reason why the fight was so much easier the second time around was because I had a bit more money and could play around with my build a little more, which would have been a really nice option to have when I was originally fighting him. I didn't need access to overpowered weapons or anything, I just wanted to try out different combos without needing to grind out level replays for more money or head to the garage and trade weapons and parts in for each other one at a time, which are things that you never really have to do past this point. In both knowledge and equipment, AC6 failed to provide advantages to the player that even remotely matched the advantages suddenly given to the boss, and it makes it feel really out of place. You can't even treat it like a skill check because what comes after it is infinitely easier. It's like having a pre-bouncer that checks if you're 26 before you get to the real bouncer who checks if you're 21. The final boss of Chapter 4 also caught heat and a nerf for being too difficult, but I actually don't believe this one deserved any changes whatsoever. For the reasons I just went over, I think Balteus is an unfair difficulty spike, but I think Ibis is just a tough but fair boss. Why is that when she can do this?
No repair kits remaining.
Good question. Ibis is undoubtedly a significant challenge, but at the point that you're at in the game, you have enough tools to get over this hump if you play your cards right. Your understanding of movement and how to avoid attacks is likely improved a lot at this point, and more importantly, your arsenal is absolutely massive and you have instant, easy access to multiple builds given how much money you've earned this late into the game. Fighting this boss is really just about finding the right build, because yeah, she sucks if you fight her with weapons that do constant damage with easy aiming and low stagger like the machine gun. She's way too fast and her attacks are way too strong. But if you move to a high precision, high stagger build and only shoot her after she's completed a dodge or a heavy attack, the weapons you have access to at this point can fully stagger her in a whopping 2 hits and absolutely dismantle her health bar while she's incapacitated. Playing around with different builds to try and find the right one took me like 45 minutes, and then beating her took me about 10 more. And I don't just think she's less bullshit because she took me personally less time than Balteus did. I think she's less bullshit because there's a direct path and strategy to counter her extreme traits, which is something you didn't have in that other fight. Do you know how much more fair a fight like Melania would be if you just had the ability to parry at certain parts of the waterfowl attack? Everybody talks about how her damage needs to be reduced or the waterfowl needs to be removed or something. You could honestly keep her as is. But if you're gonna say, hey, this enemy has a life leech move, which also applies to the mechanic that was added to this game specifically to help struggling players, making it more trouble than it's worth, and you're gonna give her the most unstoppable, difficult to escape move in the game, could you at least give me the ability to turn that back against her? If you're gonna have a random sporadically moving laser attack which destroys even full health bars that have hit the soft HP cap, can you at least give me a tiny visual representation of where it's gonna go a split second early so I'm not just playing a guessing game? If you're gonna have the second phase of the final boss instantly move around a giant arena and feature multiple long homing attacks, can you not give them the ability to send out 3 attacks at the same goddamn time? The easiest way to see just how wonky and over manipulated some of these bosses can be in the recent games is by checking out the health mechanics, because at this point you might as well put a black bar over the health bar. It doesn't give you any useful information. Melania recovers health by attacking you. Mog's health bar is larger than it seems because he recovers it halfway through. No matter what, you can only limit it a little bit with an item. The Fire Giant's second phase starts when he's around 1/3 health, but you do so much less damage even when hitting his weak spot in this phase that you need to hit it more in phase 2 than you do in phase 1, which makes no sense. Malekith's red attacks shorten your health bar. Everyone and their mother has a heal in Armored Core 6, which is so frustrating because you feel like you're making no progress when the spar starts swinging harder than an NBA wife on wine night. And that's not even mentioning the ever-growing obsession with hidden phase 2 health bars. Even in a game that I find exceptionally well balanced and fair like Sekiro, they'll explicitly tell you how many health bars the enemy has, only to psych you out and give them another one half the time for shock value. This should have been done once for the Guardian Ape because it's such an incredible, well-presented moment, and then the rest should have just told you the actual number that the bosses had. At the end of the day, I don't even know if I dislike this stuff. Like, even Balteus and Melania and all these bosses that people disproportionately complain about, I like them. I like fighting them a lot. But I also recognize that there's a way to deliver this experience and keep the difficulty high in the ways that matter, while also not overwhelming the player and frustrating your audience. Because right now we're seeing this cycle of releasing games with more and more unreasonable random difficulty spikes. People complain about it, and then eventually that results in quickly throwing together patches that nerf damage, making the fight easier but in an artificial way. I appreciate that after all this time, From Software is still finding new ideas to play around with to avoid the formula becoming stale, and like I said, I think their turn away from creating frustrating scenarios that clash with a stiff set of rules into manageable scenarios with more give or take in its rules is a good one. But in some cases, the balancing is starting to get a lot sloppier. The amount of even hardcore Souls fans who had problems with how late game Elden Ring bosses worked was surprising, and everyone acknowledges that Armored Core 6 feels like it was playtested by a single baboon. And even though the easiest and most common solution seems to be lower the enemy damage or health, which, yeah, they could definitely do with a little bit of that too, I do think some of it comes from a deeper design issue that's hopefully addressed by the team going forward. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video, leave it a like, subscribe, join the Discord, it's in the description, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.